Yeah, so thanks so much to the museum for hosting this event. Just really excited to be here to tell you about two of my favorite things, linguistics and crosswords, and thank you all for signing on. In order to solve a crossword puzzle, it's not enough to simply use language in the automatic, unconscious way you normally do. Instead, you need to analyze the language. You need to break down the language into its parts and then put those parts back together, just like linguists do. And to give a little bit more detail about how this talk's going to work, I'll first talk about the linguistics of the clues and then the linguistics of the answer grid. The topic I'll be focusing on here is ambiguity. Language is absolutely teeming with ambiguity. Pretty much every sentence you've ever heard or uttered is likely to be ambiguous in some way. But most of the time, we simply don't notice this ambiguity. Even though we normally are able to filter out this ambiguity automatically, what crossword clues do is they force you to recognize the ambiguity that normally goes unnoticed. So here's one example of a classic crossword clue. The clue is way to go. And I'm sure you've encountered this expression many times. It just means congratulations. And normally when you hear this phrase, you don't have to think too much about how the words get put together to create the overall meaning of the expression. But to answer this clue correctly, you have to think about it a little more. You have to realize that the word way could mean a path. So that way to go means a path that you could travel on. So the answer to this clue is route. A first type of ambiguity that shows up often in crossword clues is ambiguity that's only ambiguous in the way it's pronounced. An example of this is the clue movie night. Now, if you say this out loud, it sounds exactly like the common phrase movie night, where night does not have a K on it. But from looking at the spelling, you can tell it's not that type of movie night. Instead, it's saying a knight, as in a knight in shining armor, from a movie. So the answer to this clue is Jedi, because the Jedi Knights are knights in the Star Wars movies. A second type of ambiguity you'll see very often is ambiguity that works both with the pronunciation and the spelling. To illustrate this type of ambiguity, I've put here 5 different clues that all lead to the same 4-letter answer. The clues are winter coat, bank deposit, wet blanket, cold shower, and frosted flakes. And the answer that all 5 of these clues go to is snow. So each of these clues has some different ambiguity in it. In winter coat, coat is the ambiguous word. You have to interpret it as something that coats the ground instead of a winter coat. In bank deposit, the question is it a snow bank versus a financial bank? Wet blanket is similar to winter coat. It's not a blanket that goes on a bed, it's something that blankets the ground. In cold shower, you have to interpret it as snow shower instead of a shower with shampoo. And then in frosted flakes, it's snowflakes rather than cornflakes, and frosted with ice rather than frosted with sugar. But sometimes crossword constructors will work even harder to make the clues tricky by exploiting a psycholinguistic phenomenon called priming. Here's one example. The clue is Earthling who grew up near Venus. And even without any special sort of priming, I expect that the first association you have with the word Venus is probably the planet. And then here in this clue, the word Earthling adds in some priming that further strengthens that association. So when you start reading the clue, you see the word Earthling, which makes you expect other words related to science fiction or astronomy. And then after being primed in that way, once you see Venus, now without even a second's hesitation, you'll interpret the word Venus as being the planet. But all of that is a misdirection. In order to answer this clue correctly, you instead have to interpret Venus as the tennis player, Venus Williams. And so the answer, which I just gave away, was her sister, Serena, who is indeed an Earthling and who, of course, grew up near Venus. But there's another type of systematic ambiguity that crossword constructors absolutely love to use. So to illustrate that type of ambiguity, I've shown here 3 clues, which all give the same answer. The clues are chemical agent for climate change, tops for pots, and ancients, for instance. And the answer that all 3 of these have in common is anagram. That is, chemical agent is an anagram of climate change. If you rearrange the letters in chemical agent, you get the phrase climate change. So the type of ambiguity that's being exploited here is that every word in English has its normal standard meaning, but in addition, you can also interpret it as referring to the word itself, the linguistic unit. And now I'm going to talk about the grid, the other major part of a crossword puzzle. Since we're now discussing the crossword grid, the important types of units to think about will instead be how sounds get combined together to form words, or more specifically, how letters get combined together to form words. Since in the crossword grid, the basic units are letters. So the fact that such constraints exist now raises the question of what effect will these constraints and tendencies have on the crossword grid? And I think this question is especially interesting because normally when we discuss such constraints on the structure of words, we're talking about the usual way that language is presented as a one-dimensional sequence of letters or sequence of sounds. But a crossword grid is two-dimensional because you have across answers and down answers intersecting with each other. In order to investigate this question, what I've done is I created the most boring possible crossword. So what I mean by that is I went to the New York Times website and downloaded the 1,000 most recent 15 by 15 crosswords, since this is the most standard crossword size. And then for each position in this 15 by 15 grid, I found the most common thing that appears in that position. So here's the 15 by 15 grid. I started out by going to the top left corner and seeing what's the most common letter to appear in this position. And once I've collected these most common things to fill each square, I then created the most boring possible crossword simply by filling each square in the grid with the most common thing that appears in that position. And here is what we get, a thing of beauty. It might seem obvious, but it's worth pointing out the simple fact that at different positions in the grid, we see different things. And the reason that this is not a trivial fact is if we suppose for a second that there are no constraints or tendencies acting on the structure of the grid, we would expect every position in the grid to be equivalent. That is, we would expect that every position in the grid would have as its most common letter, whichever letter is most common in English overall, namely the letter E. But the fact that we see different letters in different positions tells us that there are some constraints and tendencies that are shaping the space of which types of things can appear where. So let's take a closer look at what those constraints might be. And to start, we can focus in on a few specific positions in the grid. So let's start with the lower right-hand corner. And this square, just like every square in the crossword, is part of two different words, an across answer and a down answer. And if you think about this particular square, it's going to be the last letter of both of the words that it's part of. So whichever letter is going to fit in this square is probably going to be some letter that works really well as the last letter of English words, and S definitely fits that bill. Another thing we can look at here is to focus in on a few specific letters. So one letter that's interesting for this purpose is the letter Y. The thing that makes Y interesting is that it works really well as the last letter of an English word. Lots of words end with Y, but not very well as the first letter of a word. Not many words start with Y. So to recap, our analysis for why the letter A dominates the top left of crossword grids comes down to three things. First, it's a common first letter of English words. Second, it can easily be followed by other common first letters. And third, it can easily fill the vowel niche when a vowel is needed. And in terms of the history of crossword puzzles, there's actually an interesting parallel to this view of language as something that encompasses all of human experience. Crosswords have come to reflect the richness of our language, which in turn reflects the diversity of our culture. Of course, there's still a long ways to go. It still remains the case that not all voices are equally represented in the squares of the crossword grid. Okay, so there, we've come to the end of the presentation. I hope I've been able to show some of the many ways in which crossword puzzles and linguistics can shed light on each other. In part one, I discussed crossword clues and how they make us aware of types of ambiguity that we don't normally notice. In part two, I discussed the crossword grid, its linguistic structure, and the limitations on that structure. In part three, I discussed how our language belongs to all of us, and how crossword puzzles have come to own that diversity instead of shunning it. Crossword puzzles highlight the power and the richness of our words, demonstrating how language refuses to be contained inside a few tidy little boxes.
Just let me say again, thank you, Tom, for your talk. And I think based on the comments we've been getting, it's a huge success, an A+.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you both, Greg and Jill, for organizing this. I really had a blast.